Okay, so I know this channel is dedicated to the 1990s, but this one popped into my head a couple of days ago. When I was a kid growing up in the mid-80s, we used to visit my uncle's family in Apeldoorn in the Netherlands. And first thing in the morning, when my brother, my cousins, and I would pile into the living room to watch cartoons, we'd always find my dad and his brother playing around with the remote for the TV set, which would show a strange collection of colorful words and shapes. It would tell us the sport, the news, the weather, the stock prices, and seemingly everything else going on in the world outside. What I didn't realize was that I was watching the Teletext system, an up-to-the-minute information network that provided up to 100 headlines, over 300 sports results, and over 700 weather reports from across Europe and the world. Teletext was a weird one. It had the potential to bypass the limited time slots and fixed schedule of regular news stations. And while it proved to be very popular in Britain and Europe, it never really caught on here in the United States. And for years and years, whenever that collection of bright squares and letters appears in my mind's eye like a sudden but not unwelcome house guest, I ask myself the all-important question: why not? I mean, for us folks in the 1980s, it was kind of like Wikipedia News several decades before that came into existence. Limitless, or at least limitless for the time. Information available via the TV remote, and in a format that was way more visually stunning than the black-on-white text Wikipedia gives us today. Teletext had begun earlier and elsewhere, most notably in the United Kingdom, where engineers working for BBC developed a system called Ceefax in the early 1970s after years of experimentation with data transmission and captioning technologies. The concept was deceptively simple, but its implications were far-reaching. Television signals contain small gaps known as the vertical blanking interval, invisible to viewers, but capable of carrying additional data without interfering with the image. By encoding text and simple graphics into those gaps, broadcasters could transmit pages of information alongside their regular programming without requiring additional bandwidth. A properly equipped television could decode these signals and display them as numbered pages. News headlines on one page, weather forecasts on another, sports scores on yet another, and perhaps even travel advisories or financial data elsewhere. It was a one-way system, meaning viewers could only receive information and not send anything back. But for its time, it felt remarkably advanced, offering a sense of immediacy and control that traditional broadcasting lacked. European broadcasters embraced teletext quickly and with enthusiasm. Services spread across countries, adapted to different languages and character sets, and became a standard feature of television viewing in many households. By the 1980s, many televisions sold across Europe included built-in decoders as standard features, making teletext as commonplace as channel selection itself. The success overseas did not go unnoticed in the United States, particularly among broadcasters on the West Coast, where technological experimentation often thrived and where proximity to the entertainment industry encouraged bold ideas about the future of media. American television executives saw teletext as a way to expand the capabilities of a medium that already reached nearly every household. If computers were still rare, expensive, and often intimidating, televisions were ubiquitous, familiar, and easy to use. Why not use that existing screen to deliver information in a new way? The first American experiments began cautiously, shaped by both curiosity and uncertainty. In 1978, station KSL in Salt Lake City launched an experimental teletext service under a special license, becoming one of the earliest adopters in North America. Although not located on the coast, KSL's wide broadcast reach and technical ambition made it an influential pioneer whose work informed later efforts elsewhere. Around the same time, larger networks began exploring the concept more seriously. CBS and NBC conducted trials using both British-inspired systems and alternative designs, each hoping to find a version that would work at scale in the American market. By the early 1980s, teletext experiments had reached the West Coast in earnest, particularly in Los Angeles, one of the most important and competitive media markets in the country. In Los Angeles, stations such as KNXT, later known as KCBS-TV, KNBC, and KCET, began broadcasting teletext services that combined local news, educational material, and national information feeds into a single system accessible from the television set. Public television played a particularly important role in these early efforts. KCET, the city's PBS affiliate, experimented with teletext as a tool for education, offering content that could be used in classrooms or explored at home by curious viewers. Lessons, informational pages, and public service announcements could all be delivered in this new format. The idea of television as an informational utility, not just a source of entertainment, but a platform for knowledge and public service, was central to Teletext's appeal and aligned closely with the mission of public broadcasting. A viewer could type in a number, say 100 for headlines or 200 for sports, and the television would wait until that page appeared in the broadcast cycle, then display it almost instantly once received, because all pages were transmitted continuously in a loop. There was often a short delay while the system cycled through its available pages, a quirk that became familiar to users. More advanced sets stored pages in memory, reducing wait times and making the experience feel more responsive. The pages themselves were simple but distinctive, defined by the technical limitations of the system. Each screen consisted of a grid of characters, typically 40 columns by 24 rows, rendered in a blocky monospaced font. Colors were limited to a small palette. Graphics were constructed from geometric shapes, and everything had a certain digital charm that reflected its origins. Yet within these constraints, broadcasters created surprisingly rich and varied information services. A single station might transmit hundreds of pages, covering everything from weather forecasts and traffic updates to airline schedules, financial data, and entertainment listings. Some services even experimented with interactive teletext, in which viewers could use a telephone to request specific pages or access personalized information, blending broadcast and telephone technologies in an early hint of the digital future that would later emerge. Despite its promise, teletext in the United States faced challenges almost from the beginning, many of them rooted in the structure of the American media industry itself. One of the most significant obstacles was the lack of a unified standard. While Europe had largely coalesced around a single system that ensured compatibility across countries and manufacturers, the American market became a patchwork of competing technologies. Some broadcasters used variants of the British system, known as World System Teletext, which prioritized simplicity and compatibility. Others adopted NAPTS, or the North American Broadcast Teletext Specification, a more advanced but also more complex system derived from Canadian research that allowed for improved graphics and greater flexibility. Still, others experimented with entirely different approaches, creating a fragmented landscape in which no single system could dominate. This fragmentation created confusion not only for broadcasters, but also for manufacturers and consumers. Companies hesitated to produce teletext decoders in large quantities because it was unclear which standard would prevail, and investing in the wrong technology could prove costly. As a result, the few televisions capable of receiving teletext were expensive, specialized, and often limited to certain markets. In some cases, experimental services provided modified sets to selected households simply because consumers could not buy them on their own. The technology existed, but it was not easily accessible, and that limited its ability to gain traction. Also, unlike the centralized broadcasting systems of Europe, where a small number of national channels could reach an entire country, the United States relied on a complex network of local stations, affiliates, and cable providers. A service launched in one city might not be available in another, and negotiating access to broadcast infrastructure had to be done market by market, station by station. Cost was another major obstacle that proved difficult to overcome. Early teletext decoders could add hundreds of dollars to the price of a television, a significant expense at a time when consumers were already investing in color TVs, VCRs, and expanding cable subscriptions. Although industry leaders promised that prices would fall as production increased, those reductions came slowly, if at all. Meanwhile, the benefits of teletext, while intriguing and occasionally useful, were not always compelling enough to justify the investment for the average household. News could be watched on television broadcasts, and printed newspapers remained widely available and deeply ingrained in daily life. Competition from related technologies further complicated matters and diluted the potential audience. Videotext systems, which used telephone lines to provide two-way communication, promised a more interactive experience that went beyond the limitations of broadcast teletext. Services like Prestel in the UK and various American experiments hinted at a future closer to what would eventually become the Internet, where users could request specific information rather than waiting for it to appear in a broadcast loop. At the same time, closed captioning, another technology that used the vertical blanking interval, was gaining traction, particularly after sustained advocacy from the deaf community. When the U.S. government mandated closed captioning decoders in televisions in the early 1990s, manufacturers often chose to prioritize that feature over teletext, further reducing the latter's chances of survival. By the mid-1980s, teletext services had proliferated across the United States, but their impact remained limited and uneven. Even in major markets like Los Angeles, where multiple stations experimented with the technology and where awareness was relatively high, audience adoption was low. Services such as CBS's Extravision and NBC Teletext struggled to attract users, while independent efforts like Elektra and Ceefax found only niche audiences among enthusiasts and early adopters. The lack of standardization, combined with high costs, limited availability, and growing competition prevented teletext from becoming a mainstream feature of American television. As the decade drew to a close, the momentum behind teletext began to fade almost as quietly as it had begun. Some services shut down without much notice, while others shifted toward different technologies or repurposed their infrastructure for new uses. By the early 1990s, teletext had largely disappeared from American broadcasting, overshadowed by the rapid rise of cable television, personal computers, and eventually the Internet, which offered far greater flexibility and interactivity. Ironically, many of the ideas behind teletext, on-demand information, digital text display, and interactive services would later reappear in more successful forms that finally achieved the widespread adoption teletext never quite reached. Yet teletext did not vanish entirely without leaving a trace. Its underlying techniques continue to influence later systems, including electronic program guides, closed captioning enhancements, and data services embedded in television signals. On the West Coast and beyond, the experiments of the 1980s helped lay the groundwork for future innovations in digital media, even if the connection was not always obvious. The concept of delivering supplemental information alongside video would resurface in technologies like Intel's Intercast in the 1990s and later in the integrated digital experiences of modern television and streaming platforms. Looking back, the story of teletext in the United States is both ambitious and slightly chaotic, a reflection of a moment when technology was advancing rapidly, but not always coherently. It was a time when the television industry tried to leap forward into an information age that had not yet fully arrived, guided by optimism, experimentation, and a willingness to take risks. Engineers found ingenious ways to hide data within broadcast signals, pushing the limits of what existing infrastructure could do. Broadcasters imagined new forms of content that blurred the line between television and information service. Viewers, in turn, were offered a glimpse of a more interactive future, even if only a small number ever experienced it firsthand. In the end, teletext in America did not fail because it lacked imagination or technical ingenuity. It failed because too many competing visions collided at once, and because the infrastructure needed to support it never fully aligned across a fragmented and competitive media landscape. The West Coast experiments, particularly in Los Angeles, demonstrated what teletext could be at its best, but they also highlighted the practical difficulties of scaling such a system nationwide. And so teletext became one of those fascinating technological detours, an idea that arrived just a little too early, flickered briefly across the screen, and then faded into obscurity. For a moment, though, in living rooms from Salt Lake City to Los Angeles and beyond, the television was not just a window onto the world. It was a page, waiting to be turned, hinting at a future that would arrive in a very different form.
Joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 199X, we're here just for you.